John Updike, how did this story come to you?
Well, it was at a time in my life when I wrote a lot of short stories. I was really in the business of looking for ideas, and I lived in a small New England town with my family, and in driving by the local A&P, I said to myself or my wife, why don't you ever read a story set in an A&P or some other, necessarily A&P, but A&P was the going brand name at the time and the natural title. I thought it was a good title, which is always a nice way to begin a short story. And I had seen some time before a single girl, I think, in the aisles of a supermarket wearing only a bathing suit. And it was sort of shocking. It was a stunning effect, even though on the beach she would not have been, you wouldn't have given her a second glance. So this notion of the kind of public nakedness within this commercial setting was where I began the story. And of course, you couldn't get very far with just that vision. I had to have a protagonist, and Sammy was it, and the voice, his sort of slangy voice. In walks these three girls in nothing but bathing suits, and so on. All that followed from my middle-aged vision or my young married vision. I transposed all of my lustful and quizzical feelings onto this adolescent boy.
In what ways, if any, do you identify with Sammy? Did you work in a supermarket? Does he remind you of yourself at your age?
Well, yes, I was once young. In fact, when I wrote the story, I wasn't terribly old. If it was written in '61, I would have been just 29. So I was a kid myself, really, and certainly could remember what it was like to be 18 or 19. I never worked in a supermarket, no. The notion that he would be struck by these three girls in bathing suits, certainly, I think almost any normal adolescent male would have been struck.
What about Queenie? Can you tell us a little more about her?
Well, Queenie is meant to be the beauty of the three, and it's really she who strikes him, and it's really on her behalf that he does his noble resignation, his noble surrender of his position. There is also this to be said about Queenie, that she appears to be coming from what she buys. She buys little herring snacks, and she talks of her parents. She is of a higher social level than he, so in some sense this is a blue-collar kid longing for a white-collar girl. There's an element of social inequality here, and I wonder to what extent his gesture of quitting is, in a way, has to do with the fact that she is rich and he is poor, as he sees it.
What point did you know he was going to respond and quit? His life was going to change.
Well, he's quitting in a hot flash, isn't he? A moment of manly decisiveness, and the thought does hang over his shoulder that his parents will not be pleased, just like Mr. L'Engle, his boss, is not pleased. But for the moment, at least, he's reposing in the confidence that he's doing the right thing. He has seen a kind of a wrong done. These girls have been embarrassed about being, after all, themselves. So I don't think he's too worried about the future at the moment, although the very last phrase of the story indicates that the world is going to be harder to him hereafter. He does know he's kind of crossed a Rubicon of a kind.
Which way do you think it'll be hard for him?
Well, I think the fact that he, in this small town at least, it will be known that he quit this job at the A&P, and that kind of thing does not sit well in a small town. Everything is known, really. Information is passed on, and he'll be known perhaps as a quitter.
This is a choice we all have to make at every generation. It might be made in a different setting, but it's a crucial choice.
The choice being between serving a master who seems suddenly cruel and unethical, and yes, whether you want to go along, how far you should play the game as is defined by the power structure. Yeah, I suppose that does recur, and probably not so very differently from generation to generation.
Is anything in the story intentionally symbolic? L'Engle's name, for example, implies the legal system, laws, regularities. And Sammy's name is so open and friendly. And are you conscious of these things that teachers talk about?
You certainly have to wait until the characters, as Faulkner somewhere said, name themselves. I think in one of his novels, the character has no name, and Faulkner replied that the character had never named himself. So you do kind of wait. I'm not sure it's always fully conscious a decision that can be translated into what teachers say, but sometimes they're right. In the case of Lengel, my mother's boss, when she was a shop girl, not a shop girl, she was a saleswoman at a department store in the nearby city, and her boss was Mr. Lengel, and I can remember her coming home and saying, Lengel did this and Lengel said that, so the name in my mind had a certain sort of ominous authority to it. Sammy, I don't know, it is, you say, a friendly, kind of innocuous kid's name in a way. Stokes, I think that to indicate that he was an older man. He was a married man who had acquired the dignity of his last name becoming his name.
Have you imagined Sammy's life after the story ended?
You know, the story went on in the original version. It didn't end where it does in the final and correct version, but I had written about 3 or 4 pages in which he goes down to the beach. Having quit his job, he has no reason not to go to the beach and look for these girls whose hero he has after all been. He's given up his employment for the sake of these girls, and he goes down there and can't find them. And that was the way my story ended. And the editor of the New Yorker, my editor at the New Yorker, Bill Maxwell, thought the story ended where it did. And although I've never been too crazy about editors having creative suggestions, in this case I thought it was a good one that the story really ends with his decision to walk out. What I then had left over from A&P were these 4 pages of kind of girl watching at the beach, which I turned into another story called Lifeguard. And I kind of expanded on that, so nothing was wasted.
What do you feel about our society? Is it still as sheep-like as it seemed to be when you wrote the story?
It was pretty much, however it is of today, it certainly was true of the time. This was the late Eisenhower, early Kennedy years in which people by and large conformed and were expected to conform, but there were a few voices of dissent being raised, Kerouac and Ginsberg and others, and James Dean, I don't know if he was, but anyway, there was this undercurrent of rebellion. Elvis Presley, of course, was the great symbol of something else, of not being quite so constrained, and Sammy's observations of the sheep-like behavior perhaps prepares him to behave in an unsheep-like way when he quits. He's almost saying, I'm not going to be one of you sheep, I'm going to do the right thing and then take the consequences.
How would you like the reader to see the story?
Well, of course, I don't want to read the story for any of my readers. A writer writes and a reader reads, and in a sense there is always some ambiguity or some room for various responses to a story. But I certainly see him as a typical, well-intentioned American male trying to find his way in the society, and full of good impulses. I think that he quit his job on a good impulse, really, a kind of feminist protest in a way is what he does here, and who knows what his adult life will bring, but I think for the moment he's a boy who's tried to reach out of his immediate environment towards something bigger and better.
You're aware of the voice when you're writing. You hear the story, do you?
Yeah, you're certainly aware. In these years, I think most of my stories were written in the third person. So for me to embark upon a first-person story, I certainly knew what I was doing and knew that I had to keep doing it once I'd started to do it.
Would you mind reading some of the story for us so we could hear your voice and the voice of the story?
In walks these 3 girls in nothing but bathing suits. I'm in the 3rd checkout slot with my back to the door, so I don't see them until they're over by the bread. I stood there with my hand on a box of Hi-Ho crackers, trying to remember if I rang it up or not. I ring it up again, and the customer starts giving me hell. She's one of these cash register watchers, a witch about 50 with rouge on her cheekbones and no eyebrows, and I know it made her day to trip me up. The girls had reached the meat counter and were asking McMahon something. He pointed, they pointed, and they shuffled out of sight behind a pyramid of Diet Delight peaches. All that was left for us to see was old McMahon patting his mouth and looking after them, sizing up their joints. Poor kids. Now here comes the sad part of the story. At least my family says it's sad. But I don't think it's so sad myself. The store is pretty empty, it being Thursday afternoon, so there was nothing much to do except lean on the register and wait for the girls to show up again. The whole store was like a pinball machine, and I didn't know which tunnel they'd come out of. After a while, they come around out of the far aisle, Queenie still leading the way and holding a little gray jar in her hand. And I could see her wondering between Stokes and me, but Stokesy, with his usual luck, draws an old party in baggy gray pants who stumbles up with 4 giant cans of pineapple juice. So the girls come to me. He becomes their champion, in a sense.
I quit.
Even though they don't know it. And that the story would end right there wasn't entirely clear to me. There was a little bit that we went on and began to look for them, and of course never could see them. He had given up his bow tie and his good name for girls who then vanished on him. Yeah, it was sort of the way I originally saw it ending.
Story of our lives.
Yeah, story of our lives, right. Any good story should be to some degree the story of all of our lives.
Thank you, John Updike. We appreciate your spending the time with us. We know that anybody that writes 3 pages a day, year after year, provides us with such good reading, wants to get back to work. But we appreciate the time that you gave us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.